Hey guys, how are you? If you were with us on Sunday, we are talking about the importance of learning how to think through the gospel. And I just wanted to take a few minutes today just to share a little bit about critical theory and how it impacts our culture here in Vancouver and in Canada. And we also see it affecting a lot of Western cultures, whether it's Europe or the United States. And it's so important for us to learn to think as Christians through the gospel and to realize that many times a gospel worldview is coming in clash. It's clashing, it's conflicting with the values that are in our culture. And that if we don't learn to see every aspect of our life through the gospel, that Jesus has a perspective on our money, on our time, on our body, on what we do with a career, on who we marry. He has a perspective on all of these things, and there is a biblical worldview. If we don't learn to understand this, our faith will be quite fragile. And so it's very important to learn this. So I just wanted to pop in today and talk for a few minutes about how critical theory is impacting the values and the worldview of our culture. And that if we learn to understand this, we will begin to see the strengths that it offers, but also the points where we're coming into collision with values that are in our society. And that's because Jesus has a different perspective on that. And that we must become strong enough to choose the Jesus way. So let's talk a little bit about critical theory. And then tomorrow I'm just going to pop back on for a few minutes and talk about its strengths and weaknesses and how we learn to see critical theory in our culture through the gospel, the points where there might be some strengths to critical theory and the points where the gospel is going to be going a completely different direction. And we're going to be living in that tension of which way will we choose. So critical theory is really a social theory it's a worldview that is based around power dynamics and the division of groups. And the first thing that's really important to understand is that all of society is broken into groups of oppressors and oppressed people. And this is based off of your gender, your age, your physical ability or disability, the color of your skin, your socioeconomic class. All of these represent a group that you fall into. And it's either an oppressor group or an oppressed group. Another important concept that comes in at this point is called intersectionality. And that means that you as a person belong to you belong to many different groups and you experience oppression according to critical theory in a unique way. This means that if you just take myself as an example, according to critical theory, if men are the oppressor group, then I fall into the oppressed category as a woman. However, I do have white skin. So in that sense, I fall into the oppressor group of having white skin as compared to a Black female who would fall into the oppressed group in both of those instances. And this is just a way that shows that there are different experiences that cannot be compared when you look at each of the groups that we all fall into. And this is a very divisive way to view society because we see right now that just for example, the most hated group in our entire society in the West right now is white men. Or you might even see people talking about older white men as being toxic masculinity. And one important thing to realize about critical theory and its influence on our culture is that people as individuals don't have a character that matters anymore. It's only the group identity that matters. And so it's impossible, for instance, for my husband, Chris, not to oppress people. As a white man, he's part of an oppressor group, and he just is tied up in that group identity, regardless of his character and the way that he conducts himself. So this is a very divisive way to view society, broken into only oppressor or oppressed groups. Here's the second thing that I want to just highlight is that this oppression takes place through hegemonic power, which is that the dominant group, the oppressor group, forces its values, its norms, its way of being onto oppressed people. And so we see in this sense that oppression has moved it's moved beyond violence and coercion. It's moved to value systems and lived norms. And that if you are experiencing truth from someone who falls into an oppressor group, you should always be suspicious, because really they're just trying to have power over you. That's what critical theory would tell us. And that all truth is really just power and coercion trying to take away your liberation. Here's the third thing, is that liberation is our highest moral duty, because freedom is really the only value that our culture has. It's our highest value as our culture. And this makes a break away from a lot of traditional values. Even if you think back to the time of Aristotle, who would say goodness and beauty and compassion, these are virtues that are upheld in our society. In critical theory, liberation is our moral duty, and to liberate oppressed people from the oppressor. And so this is what our focus is in society. And the fourth thing that I want to highlight is that lived experience of oppressed people is the most important thing, and that people who belong to any kind of oppressor group, whether it is physical ability or class or race or gender, if you belong to the dominant group, you cannot really offer a different perspective, because it's viewed in critical theory's eyes that the oppressed person has some kind of special truth, some kind of inside truth to the experience that you don't possess. And so lived experience can even become more important than objective evidence. And so this is, kind of all on the theoretical level, but we see it coming out in people's frustration, like I said, with old white men. Sometimes even as we look at the presidential race in the United States, people just say, we need someone different as the president, no more old white men. And they put everybody into that group identity because, again, you can't be seen as an individual. You can only be seen in this group identity. I think it's just, I know that a lot of this is on the theoretical level, but tomorrow we're going to kind of dive into what are the strengths of critical theory and some things that it highlights for us, and what are some ways that it really diverges from the gospel. And so I hope this is in some way helpful as we continue on digging down and learning how to think, how to see as Jesus sees. It's going to be super helpful for us to look at the things that are driving the culture around us, because sometimes we learn best through comparison. So this is just a little dive into critical theory. Again, just to kind of summarize for you, it is about power and division. Society is divided into either oppressor or oppressed groups. Oppression happens through hegemonic power, in which the ideals of the dominant group are impressed upon the oppressed group. Liberation is the highest moral duty, and lived experience is more important even than objective evidence. And that if you're in an oppressor group, all that you can do is listen and learn. We see this common language right now. This has very strong implications, even to say that it doesn't even matter how you conduct yourself. We see this happening, especially with all of the racial protests going on in the United States right now, that what we're hearing from the Black community, or at least a portion of the Black community, what we're hearing is that if you are white, then you are, in some sense, whether you recognize it or not, in some way racist, for participating in a racist system, and that your individual character doesn't really it isn't taken into account because you're part of that group identity. We also see sometimes people look at Christians and they think that all Christians, because of what they believe Jesus says about sexuality, all Christians must be homophobic, which as a Christian, I would say that absolutely isn't true. But again, when things get wrapped up in group identity and we start talking about oppression, this is where the conversation can lead to a place of division rather than a place of unity and learning to come together. And so I hope that this is in some way helpful. And yes, I will be back later this week with part 2.